Here we go. And
Bum 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 bum.
hey, all. It's nice to see everybody. Thank you for coming by. I think maybe we'll rip around the four of us first, and then anybody else who wants to introduce yourself if you wish, and we'll say who we are and where we are. I'm John Spirasavet. This is what my office looks like all the time at Temple Beth Abraham in Nashua, New Hampshire. Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Rosenthal. I'm the Director of Youth and Family at Central Synagogue in New York City. And I
Dan.
apologize in advance for any very loud banging. I live in a construction zone. Well, I work in a construction zone.
Um, I am Dan Ross, and I am currently in my basement for the same reason that Rabbi Rosenthal is complaining about the construction zone, because it is literally right above my office. So I figured that that would not do well for the recording. But also, I have to say, having listened to the theme song, just because of how fast I generally listen to podcasts, it sounded, even though it was 18 seconds, achingly slow. Achingly slow. I was like, what do we have to do to speed it up? Okay, anyways, I'll stop talking. Hi, John.
And Sari.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sari Laufer. I am the Chief Engagement Officer at Stephen Wise Temple in Los Angeles, and may or may not be coming to you with a fever. It's not clear, so
Oh, no.
you have to forgive anything I may say.
Absolutely. Hope you feel okay and feel better. Let me make sure I've made all of our four of us into co-hosts. And if anybody else wants to, you're welcome to unmute yourself and introduce yourself if you wish by who you are and where you are, or you can type it in the chat if you prefer. And oh, and Sari is upset. Oh, there. As I said, I'll give a moment if anybody wants to. You can say who you are, where you are.
This is Daniel Kurzine. I'm an associate rabbi at Oak Park Temple, just outside Chicago.
Daniel, another of our co-hosts. Great to see you. Well, I would encourage anybody, if you wish to, we're a small group at the moment live, so you can unmute to ask us things, or you can chat us things. We'd certainly love to know if the chat, if you want, as we go along, and we'll try to track that, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook. And you can even tell us where you are. If you want to identify yourself as I'm a 60% Chidi or an aspiring Tahani. And I thought actually that might be a fun way to start. So first of all, I know that Priya Parker says that gatherings should have, very clearly defined, who's and whys. And this is a little more loose than that. The four of us who have collectively kind of co-hosted more of the episodes kind of thought it would be nice to get together and talk. And this will be maybe a first or second draft of some reflections that we have not at all rehearsed or even actually hardly decided what our agenda is altogether, so we can help create it. But I did think it might be fun to start with characters. And maybe, Sari was the first person who kind of breakfast clubbed this thing as like, you can't make me say, that I'm more one than the other. But
all of us are athletes. All of us are.
Exactly. And so I will say, I don't know if any of the three of the rest of you know who you have said you were over the course of 4 seasons, but maybe we'll whip around. And if you have anything to say about that, I will start while you think about that by just telling you I've done some stats on the sort of catching up. They might be off by 1 or 2. To my surprise, and probably to your surprise also, Dan. All right, great.
I just want credit though, because I think I am the only one of the co-hosts who has sent John pictures from the actual set of The Good Place, right?
We are hoping we should have a group field trip to the
anytime.
Good
Come
set.
visit.
Absolutely. So there have been roughly 43 responses by people who have the rules have been that each season, when you host for the first time, you get to say, I feel like I'm most like X character, and I wish I were more like. And I don't know if you have a guess or if you've actually put any, had any office pools going, but believe it or not, only just a little more than 50% of all of us Jewish educators have said that we are Cheaties mostly. And so that you might find that surprising. And that percentage kind of dipped fairly precipitously in the last season, where it was the minority, actually. Maybe that was changes in Chidi. And then in terms of aspirations, there was a surprising comeback by Jason over the course of the seasons, who collectively had about 25% of the "I wish I was more like," and then it was Eleanor, Michael, and Janet, more or less equally, and with Chidi coming up the rear, I guess, because most of us thought we were Chidis kind of already. And this is, not just the four of us and Daniel, but sort of everybody all along. And so I would go around and ask any of, first of all, the four of us, if you have a final thought now of either one of those characters you're feeling more like, or you feel have really, connected to as that character was or has evolved. Anybody want to jump in?
I mean, I'll jump in as the non-Chidi. And I actually do remember, I don't actually remember what I said, but I remember on the first time I came on saying, I think I'm supposed to say Chidi, right? Like, I think, especially as rabbis, I think there is this sense that, like, of course, we're going to have the like big philosophical mind, but I was never a Chidi. I actually don't think I ever aspired to be a Chidi. I might have said closer to Tahani, but I can't. Dan looks surprised. I'm not sure why. No one knows me. Actually,
No, not at all surprised. Actually, like, really feeling it. Like, you've got that glamour about you. Sarah. Always have.
Thank you. I mean, especially right now with my fever, really. But I think at the end, like when I come around to it, I would probably say closest to Eleanor, right? Of this sort of like lives in the very real world, and for whatever that is. And also I think mostly I feel like, I know it in theory, and then over the last however many years of my own life, like have centered in on like relationship in my life and how that is actually central. And I think that is sort of what Eleanor learned, right? Going from being hugely selfish and not that I think I was hugely selfish before, but like not really thinking about the way her actions impact others. And then when she finally like had a crew, right? Like had people who both cared about her and also who she could see the impact on them, changed the way she was. And so I think that, and then I think maybe my aspiration, it's funny, I never think about Michael and Janet as being options. I don't know why. But maybe my aspiration.
Neither are human.
Huh?
Neither are human.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm biased against the non-human characters. But maybe is Michael. Because he's just so like, I think it's maybe his like wonder still at the world, right? Even though he's been alive for however many billions of years, right? And like seen so much, like he still has this sort of childlike wonder. And I think that like in some ways, maybe in contrast to Eleanor, who has the cynic, which everyone who knows me knows I definitely have the cynic, like love that childlike wonder. And so maybe I aspire a little bit more to that.
Which you said, actually, you, Sari, said at the first season and the last, with the little Jason interlude in the, although you were, I think, I'm most Jason resistant, possibly
For sure.
in the group here, but that's what I heard you say. Yeah.
I was also not a Chidi.
Yay!
I definitely.
That's why we're friends.
I'm not a Chidi, and I never will be, and I don't think I ever really aspired to be a Chidi. And I think the nature of like both my work and my life means I can't be a Chidi. Like I can't be a person who doesn't make decisions. I work with children. I have to make a lot of decisions in the moment all the time, constantly. And I can't have a stomachache every time I make a decision or have a stomachache in an attempt
You make
to make
such good decisions, Rabbi Rosenthal.
I appreciate
the
that.
best
But
decisions.
but I can't be a Chidi, and I don't think I ever was a Chidi. Like I think I said I was like Michael. Is that right?
You said that every time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love Sari's assessment of Michael. That's also why we're friends. And just sort of the way that he looks at the world. But I would say sometimes I feel in my professional life a lot like a Janet, where people come ask me a question, I have to give them an answer right away and then move on to the next thing.
To be fair, I think of her as my Janet too. Like I just expect her to know all the things, and she usually does.
I think of Sari as my Tahani. Like if I need to know what glamorous outfit to get, Sari's my Tahani. But I would say like I think sometimes a lot of my role is like, what's the answer to this question? What's the answer to that question? What's the answer to that question? And I love that I love the opportunities in my professional life where I get to explore something a little bit more and ask questions about it and understand it. And sometimes it, like Eleanor, in a little bit of a cynical way, but sometimes like Michael, I think he's like Eleanor in a lot of ways, but without the layer of cynicism on him.
Rebecca, can I ask though, like how do you deal with Michael season 1 and the deviousness? Like, do you consider yourself to have that kind of demonic character to you? Have you
When I think Rebecca, I do
seen
think
evil
demonic.
plans?
You don't know about my evil plans, Dan. They've been long simmering. They're long simmering evil plans. You know, I don't think of myself as demonic for sure. I hope none of us really do. But I do think when I think about Michael, even in the beginning where he's torturing the people, I think about him as sort of having a little piece inside of him that's like, maybe there's another reason I'm doing this, or maybe I should do something else, or maybe I should help people, right? He has, in my mind, even from the very beginning, a little bit of a conscience. And so I think I'm probably not a season 1 Michael. At least I hope not. Although maybe sometimes my children would beg to differ and think I am season 1 Michael, with evil demonic plans to ruin their lives. But I would say the idea from Michael that you can grow and change and look at the world in new ways. And I also appreciate his desire to be human and all the things that come with that. That, you know, I'm happy to be a human most of the time.
Well, I will say that I realized as I was thinking about this just the other day that the person I'm striving to be is Tahani at the end. I think you would be perhaps happy, Sari, with that answer of mine, or intrigued. And I realized that the Tahani who's like willing to wear the jeans overalls, you know, finally, and who has this very eclectic list of things. I want to pave the driveway and make a perfect cabinet and things like that, and sort of fulfill my existence by not ending it as the one of our gang who really does that. And I really relate. I've mentioned periodically in my congregation this song by Naomi Shemer called Od Lo Ahavti Dai, I have not loved enough, which seems to be a person living up, sort of listing out all kinds of things that a person could do, which seem to be like just everything. And I often think, you know, what are my talents or my dreams, and do they only fall in one category? Or if I had eternity, that would be Sari is putting in the chat the Israeli folk dance instructions, and in fact I don't do that just because of that song. I have been willing to learn the dance, which I don't really do very well otherwise, but I really love that dimension. And we talked in the last episodes about kind of this sense of, if you really could, you know, decide that you had a limited amount of time and you should focus it on figuring out sort of who you are, Jason style, you know, and or if you could have all of those. And I'm a little stuck on who I would think still now. I think that I think the Chidi and I said at the beginning of this last season that kind of the Michael who's sort of grown into the awkward mentor type person who is you know, definitely sort of wants to be that person, but also in a sense either experiences or owns the awkwardness of trying to help people with his wisdom. That sort of resonates for me in a certain way, although I will claim an amount of cheatiness still as well. I don't know, Daniel, if we put you on the spot as another host, if you want to jump in with any of your current relatings to the characters.
Yeah, I'm probably still Chidi with an aspiration for Eleanor. I think at heart, I still find myself the prevaricator, and also one who aspires to be able to take charge with what ultimately ends up being true compassion, the way we see Eleanor doing.
I mean this as a real compliment, which is you're like one of the most cheaty people I know.
Agreed, with love, like absolutely
Accepted
love.
as given.
Yeah. Like that's how we should do it. We should all name who the other person is.
Ooh, we do happen. It happens that we are. And I should say that, by the way, that this podcast was not created only by people who knew each other. We had a number of people who met, for the first time while recording these episodes together, which has been great. Unfortunately, none of them here in the room right exactly at this moment. If anybody else out there on the stream either has someone you want to reflect on about with yourself, or how you've maybe grown in relation to that character, you're welcome to.
I also don't think I
unmute or
piped
chat
in
that.
yet.
I'm sorry, Dan. Yes,
Oh, it's
go.
fine.
Go.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think I said very similar to my namesake, Daniel, that I was a Chidi aspiring to be an Eleanor, in my first take on the show. But maybe I admire Jason's presence at this point, especially like at that last moment, his ability to just sit for 1,000 years with himself and become a monk. That sounds like really nice.
Let's see, someone, do we have something typing along? Looking. So Judith from North Carolina asked the question of like, how did we come up with this podcast? And since we were folks among those conversations, we could definitely talk about that. I remember talking about this certainly like in 2019, I want to say, certainly by 2020, sort of before the pandemic started, definitely with Rebecca and Sari. And I feel like the two of you had talked about a project related to this. Can you tell us, can you illuminate that?
Sure. I mean, Rebecca's going to correct me if I'm wrong. I think we had originally talked about a curriculum. Like I was like, I really want to teach. Because I'm not a Chidi. I'm like, I don't really do philosophy, theology type teaching all that often. I mean, it obviously comes up in my work, but I was like, but I really want to do it. I think there's like such fascinating theology and it feels so accessible. And we sort of talked about it, but didn't. And then at some point came into the conversation and you were like, we should do this conversation. That's what I remember.
Rebecca, do you have any added memories?
Well, that feels accurate. Like, I think a lot of times we're looking at media and other things that we consume as like, how can I teach this? Or how can I make this relevant to the work that I do? And The Good Place has so much richness in that area. And just so many questions. So yes, we talked about it, but it was John Spiro Savet who really took the ball and ran with it. So feeling very grateful to you.
I can't remember exactly when it was that we would have initially discovered that we had this interest in common. I do remember that. So the four of us are all part of the alumni community of the Wexner Foundation's graduate fellowship program. And I do remember that I did a session. Oh, yes. The fellowship that is retiring and evolving into something else. And I remember, I did a session a few conferences ago about the West Wing and sort of, because I think there was an invitation to do something about pulp culture and whatever. And it was a session about sort of the use of power for good. The use of like power, sort of wrestling with power for good in the West Wing. And that, I know Sari was there, and I think that that was a blast. And it might have got us talking about what are other things that are kind of like that. And I will say that so I was trying to recruit people. There are two things. One is to recruit as many voices and diverse as possible, to do something that I think initially I thought would be like a few of us would just do this together the whole time. And the other thing was a real hope that if we had the idea that we could find a sort of podcast producing group who could do it, which we did not. So we're self-producing this. The other thing is that when the pandemic started, it was really right after, I think we were like right in the middle of these early conversations, and it seemed like laughing in this fashion about things was hard to do. Because I think the podcast has sort of been in the mode of where we're kind of, whimsical while we're studying serious things. And certainly early 2020 turned out to be not a whimsical time. And then I think it came back that we started to have conversations about when it was, more or less a year later, 2021 in the summer, they thought about, is it time to come back to this, especially as so many of the conversations in the world around the pandemic, around George Floyd, around the presidential elections were really so infused with ethics that this seemed like a nice way to do some outreach that might be a little less serious at a time, and maybe we could use a little. I know that for me personally, that comic relief was welcome in a time when I when I didn't have that collectively with a group of people. Well, let's see. Not seeing any other particular questions and comments we forge ahead. I am wondering, just to put us all on the spot, if we have any thoughts on, like, is there in a sort of in a global sense some kind of, was it a Jewish surprise that this rewatch has brought to you, or whether in a big sense about Teshuvah, or maybe just about some teaching that you were like delighted to see come to life in a way, or another thing that we could talk about is if there's something that's like, what, I've been thinking about this Jewish idea and I so much love better how this the Good Place kind of has a better take on something that I've now like adopted. And anybody have something top of mind while you think about Rebecca?
I was just gonna say, I think one of the fun surprises of the Good Place was just like how Jewish it was. And even though I always had a sense that, there was a lot of good material in the show and so much to hold on to, it wasn't until we started digging into it episode by episode and looking for different texts to connect to it, and that the Jewishness of it really came out. And I think that the final test that they devised to get into the Good Place is like the most Jewish option ever, right? Like you get to try again as many times as we don't all have unlimited life, but you get to try again until you get it right. And that's so rooted in how we understand our lives and tshuva, and this idea that, we can always start again, and that there's lots of different ways of starting again, but also that tshuva requires true action. Sari changed her background and it's really cute. That tshuva requires true action and really thinking about what you did wrong and getting yourself in the same position and making a different choice, and that final idea of how one gets into the Good Place feels very linked to Jewish ideas to me.
I would add that one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is there's this, and I actually remember this being part of the conversation, I think after the end of season 2, there's been a lot of talk about, is the world a simulation? Are we under the, rule of some, far advanced civilization, and we're basically just living in a video game that they've created? And there's a lot of people who actually believe this, including Elon Musk. And Ezra Klein would say on one of his other podcasts that if you think about that as the way that if you think about his self-understanding as being in a simulation, actually kind of explains a lot of the way that he lives his life, because he treats it like a game. And I think a lot of people do that. And I think that what the Good Place comes to teach us in a really powerful way is that it doesn't matter whether we live in a fabricated space like the Good Place, like the neighborhood. It's still, what matters is how we treat each other. The fact that we live in a simulation or in a created, in fact, specifically because we do live in a created world, or at least Judaism teaches that we live in a created world from the beginning of the book of Genesis, indicates that we have obligations to each other, that how we treat each other, it's the source of morality, is the fact that the world is not ours. So that's kind of something that I've been thinking about, and a little bit of the nature of the gamification of things, and how the gamification's all wrong, the point system's all terrible. And anyways, I'll stop on my little.
Well, Dan, but are you talking, Dan, also about sort of the issue of determinism, whether we know whether we're actually making choices or not, it still matters?
Less about determinism, although there are folks who have that question, but more just about the idea that we don't live in a real world. Right. And the Good Place isn't a real world. And actually, that's where they go to learn about how to be better people, right? In a world that isn't, quote, real, or a base reality, or whatever kind of language we want to use to talk about it.
For me, one of the surprises has been around, I want to say, ritual. And I thought that this would be a way of initially just kind of lining up philosophical ideas from the Western tradition with conceptual ideas about ethics in the Jewish tradition. And I think the first like amazing things that happened were in season 2, thinking about Purim and this idea when they have the when they have to go through bad place headquarters, I guess, and dress up, and this really interesting conversation I had with Ilana and Daniela about these are already people who are sort of not living their real lives and then taking on these other things, and sort of and then this whole I've been on this whole shtick about Michael is Mordechai and Eleanor is Esther, and kind of Eleanor's an Esther character, which I think really I love Purim. And then I had this conversation with Rebecca about Yom Kippur related to the episode where they've gotten, it's when they get the demons all to leave in season 2, and they've got this sort of last before they destroy the neighborhood and head off. So I guess it's the prior episode, and they hang out there, they dance, they play music, they catch up with each other and sort of process. And Rebecca has long said, I think if this is not an actual quote, Yom Kippur should be a dance party or something like that. And then Sari and I talked about the funeral episode and just all everything from having this opportunity to hear what people think about your legacy while you're there, to this idea of like going back to the place, somehow representing a place that's of significance to you. Jason's was born in a swimming pool in Jacksonville and all that, so that was one thing that was kind of a total surprise to me. I didn't think there'd be anything about kind of ritual, kind of the official Jewish stuff. In fact, I thought that the whole kind of appeal of this kind of podcast would be to sort of talk about these kinds of ideas, all divorced from all the baggage of ritual that often drive people away, sadly, from Judaism. I don't know, Sari, if you have anything you want to jump in on, and sort of a Jewish surprise or kind of thing that has illuminated in a new way for you.
I mean, look, what I think part of it is recognizing, I think probably for all of us on this call, right, the way that we look at universal concepts with a particularist lens, and that like reminder of the way that some of our particular language can also be expanded universally, right? Like the whole notion of tshuva, which like I agree, that for me, that's, I think that's like the center of this story, but I don't know, I don't know how many people working on it or writing it would use that language or had that in their head, though I imagine it's a non-zero number. The other thing that I was thinking about and have been thinking about actually, so I lead services on Friday mornings in our day school for the littlest, sometimes for preschool, but now for kindergarten and first grade. And it's very sweet because everyone gets to be what we call Klei Kodesh, like they get to come up and like lead a part of the service, which for the kinder and the first grade is mostly they say a sentence. Well, the kinders really just come up and like say a sentence. So for the first graders, write a little thing. And what I find fascinating about it is they're talking about concepts like peace and tikkun olam, right, the repair of the world. But they're, not that I think a 5 or a 6 or a 7-year-old has less. I actually think they often have more, right? But their language for it is not necessarily as sophisticated as a 30-something or a 40-something-year-old. And so they say the words, I think, similar to the way we talk about theology, right? That like we can only talk in our sort of limited experience. And so they will say, like, peace in the world is, I can bring peace to the world when that was the prompt this year, right? So it would be like, I can bring peace to the world when I share my toys with my sister, right? And like, so I think about that, and what I often think about is like, wow, yeah, that actually, like, that is in your world, an example or an experience of that. And I think about that also with The Good Place, where I think they're presenting these big ideas. And then, of course, I think in all senses, the big ideas can only be manifested in, like Dan said, in the ways that we are responsible to one another. And I think manifest in tiny ways.
And I think related to that, right, is the idea that all of our choices matter in a real way, and not just in a way of, have I solved global warming, right? And, you make all these jokes about like, oh, this paper straw, and like, is that really doing anything for the world? Now, paper straws are obviously—
I am coming for the paper straws.
They were created by the demon
before Hashem. They are, okay, but anyway.
Paper straws were created by the demons in the bad place, 100%. But I think the idea, right, that we should train ourselves to make small choices that that and not just write off choices because they don't have some kind of like massive global impact that stops global, stops climate change, or completely eliminates gun violence. And I think that The Good Place really leans into that idea that our choices, big and small, do matter, and that we have that piece of Talmud that I believe has been brought to this podcast before, right? That everyone should walk around with the idea that their scales are evenly balanced, and so every choice you make can either tip you to the good side or the bad side. And I think that's where The Good Place kind of in some ways ends up, right? That you have these when they had the accountant and all of that, you had what are all the unintended consequences of your choices. But in the end, it's really the small choices that we're making and the small things that we're choosing to do better that, as Sari said, can bring peace to the world.
And just picking up on one more thread of that, Rebecca, what you just said made me think of an example that Michael Schur gives in his book, How to Be Perfect, about like thinking too hard about the long-term consequences of every action. He talks about like, you see an old lady crossing the street and she needs help. You help her cross the street, and then you discover that she's a secret Nazi, right? And like, still you help the old lady across the street, right? Like you did the best you could in that moment with the limited knowledge that you had. And that's something that I think that The Good Place also teaches us to really honor. Because a lot of the show is about the nature of intention, as well as in the conversation that John and I had last week with Pamela Hieronymy. John, you're muted.
Yes, a conversation we haven't yet published, but will be coming out soon. Yeah. Yeah, I have wrestled as all of you know, and whether you've listened or talked with me, with this question about kind of the impact of us. And I think what's really interesting at the end of the show is that there is, different characters I think seem to have different senses of like whether they should stick around in their afterlife existence, their Good Place existence. And for some of it, it's based on what did I want to accomplish, what I think was my destiny. And some of it was tied with kind of how is my destiny tied up with other people, although I don't think they draw that out tremendously. I think one of my favorite pieces of just a little bit in the ending episodes is where Brent is still not getting in, even, he still has to be sent back because he still doesn't get the Me Too issues, and that seems to be one they call out a bunch. And I think it's important that they have that, like it's not in that part, because his badness is tied up with a whole bunch of things. And but I do wonder about that. And I think that some of the intriguing moments are where they do try to tie the kind of destiny of the individual fulfilling their self into the whole. And I as I preached on Rosh Hashanah last year about really one of the things being that moment in the Janet's episode where Eleanor is where kind of that whole Janet's void is coming apart, and like basically existence is going to be destroyed, while Eleanor is having an existential crisis about who she is, and it's Chidi who kind of helps her reconstitute herself. And in finding herself sort of saves the universe, while sort of up in accounting land, Michael is sort of dealing with the okay, I need to take a stand on, Janet challenges him to sort of take a stand on this whole accounting system. And but they don't say exactly how. Like I want to know, like, how is it that which is why again I like this Tahani at the end, who's like, okay, well Tahani has her individual projects of designing the perfect furniture. And then she's like, I think I want to be an architect and work on the whole, which is in a way kind of a transformation of her philanthropy, which in life was so like, it did good things, but it was rooted in this horrible thing in her family. But she kind of essentially becomes that philanthropist that she had a kernel of, that just by her placement in the world, which I think is cool.
Well, some of the Good Place, right, is about like you can't outrun your essence, but you can use it for good instead of for evil. Think about Eleanor, right? Her essence actually really remains in terms of her in her life, she's using it for scheming the elderly and, you know, whatever else. But in the good place, she uses that kind of like drive and creativity and for good instead of for evil, right? To save her friends, to think about, you know, how she can outwit the demons. And she's really one of the most interesting and creative people that are there. And the same happens with Chidi, right? He can't outrun his sort of professor essence, but he figures out a way to make it work, instead of having it give him a totally debilitating stomach ache along the way. And also the banging is back, so apologies for the background noise.
Rebecca, what you just said reminded me of the story of Zeusia, who, you know, arrives at the heavenly gates and has striven his entire life to be Moses, and then, you know, he says to God, like, correct me if I'm misstating the story, but says to God, I strove my whole life to be Moses, you know, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, and God says, well, why weren't you Zeusia? Right. And like that, I love that drawing of, you can't outrun your essence, but how can you use your essence for good, to be fully yourself and to make the biggest difference?
So I've been thinking about something where I think The Good Place filled in what was probably a kernel of a Jewish thing, a thing that seems Jewish, but where I actually don't feel like there's such tremendously developed stuff in the Jewish sources. And that is really in the idea of kind of friendship, or the group as important for one's own ethical development, coming into one's own. And, you know, again, Breakfast Club, you know, clearly it's kind of a trope in culture that I'm intrigued about. But I feel like, you know, we talked in the later season about how, you know, Brent, Simone, John, like they're not the same kind of, not just anybody, even though you want to, you know, can develop into that group for you. And this group of different people becomes that for each other. And I feel like we have this one idea of aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver, get yourself a master teacher and have a partner, who either a study partner or kind of a partner in your spiritual or personal development. And a lot of things hang on the commentaries to that. But I feel like when I've looked for real kind of Jewish philosophizing about this, that even though we talk about community all the time, and especially we do in our work, that I feel like I don't point to some kind of classical Jewish writing that says, you know, this is what friendship is, you know, at that level supposed to be. And it's made me want to sort of think about where should I be looking for that, or is it just all there, like the show portrayed it so beautifully and took the premise of, you know, Friends and Cheers and Gilligan's Island, whatever, and took it to this other level.
Well, it's interesting, right? I think our tradition, right? There's o chavruta o mituta, right? Like give me liberty, or give me friendship, I get, right? Partnership, or give me death, basically. Like it's a choice, but it's always a one-on-one. It's always a dyad, right? Or I think our tradition actually has a lot to teach about that type of relationship. Like, in fact, about an intimate relationship that is not, well, sometimes that may or may not be romantic, depending how you read some of the text, right? But like that on its surface is a platonic relationship, and the ways that impacts and influences our life, but it is always a dyad, right? You don't see a lot in any of the literature about like that expansion of like, okay, like maybe we have these different sort of chavruto, we have these different partnerships in the story. But we don't have in our text like an expansion of that, where you'd have like several coming together to form a group.
There is actually one wonderful passage in Ta'anit, but I would say that, to your point, Sarah, and I'm going to share it in a second, but to your point, I would not say it's certainly part of, like, it feels like part of the zeitgeist of Judaism, but there is this wonderful passage. So it's Rabbi Bar Chana said, "Why are matters of Torah compared to fire, as it is stated in the book of Jeremiah? Is not my word like fire, says Adonai. To tell you, just as fire does not ignite in a lone stick of wood, but in a pile of kindling, so too matters of Torah are not retained and understood properly by a lone scholar who studies by himself, but by a group of sages." So there is at least one tradition to point to, but I would say that this is not the prevailing tradition across. But I just wanted to throw that out there, so in case anybody needs one.
And we have tossed in, and I want to say, if memory serves, that maybe Ben Gurin was the first person to pull out some more sources and that do kind of talk about, well, although they do talk again about that kind of chavruta partner relationship, as I think about it. And often in the Talmudic stories, when the rabbis are presented as a group working on something, it's often a bad story. It's a story either about conflict, or it's a story about learning from each other, but we don't really hear the mechanism other than by intellectual argument. And I feel like I want more of that. I feel like part of my own teshuva is that, and that what I admire in the show is the way that people react to each other, either directly by seeking out some guidance or by realizing that they've sort of taken on some characteristics or wisdom from the others. I felt like someone had the tip of their tongue on that. And by the way, again, just encourage. Oh yeah, please, yeah.
I just think that there's this notion, and I'm trying to. I might be inaccurate, but I would say that in addition to friendship, what we sort of have in The Good Place that's common across, our non-Jewish literature is the notion of found family. Whereas our sacred literature through the Torah is really the story of a single family as they evolve into a nation. There isn't the same kind of understanding of like we throw a group of people together and they become a family. I would say, but maybe I'm not thinking accurately or fully or expansively of textual options in that way.
I'm encouraging people who are on the stream here to add a comment, a question, and you're certainly welcome to unmute yourself too and throw something out there, either of your own insight that you've learned on anything we're talking about, or something even generally related, or something you want us to respond to in any way.
I did have one reflection, which was that The Good Place was pitched to me and is often pitched as a TV show about moral philosophy. And you have the teacher who's there at the beginning with the blackboard teaching principles of moral philosophy. And over time, and this was commented upon a couple of times during the course of the podcast, the actual philosophy lessons diminish. And the story is told through the lives of the characters. And I was reflecting on the extent to which you see that also as manifest in Jewish sources, how we have a couple of instances of, I'm going to teach you some philosophy. And often it's most profoundly felt, the conclusions of philosophy are most profoundly felt through the stories told through characters living them, or as they are translated, the principles are translated into the lives that we lead, so that we are able to become the protagonists in the stories that we tell of others. We find ourselves in their shoes more often than we find ourselves in their, like trains of thought.
I don't know if you want to talk a little back and forth about that, Daniel, too, but I think that and this is the virtue of like not thinking things through, at the beginning of a project. And I have to say, in my life, I've been more involved in startup projects than in maturing a project to stage 2. Like I've worked for startups, or like now an organization that's more than 100 years old. But so I thought that there would, like, I remember there being sort of more of that blackboard philosophy around, and I think I like the way it appeals to me, for one thing, and I think I've had this desire to think about those big ideas and see how they come back. And partly, I guess one of the questions I've had, and we probably 5 of us here have different settings about how much we think about wanting those big conceptual ideas to be our guides, versus that's not the only thing that we're looking at. And it's a little bit to the question of, Talmud shemevili de ma'aseh, is study valuable because it really does have an impact, whether it's Torah study or this kind of commenting on a text more loosely described. And because I feel like I now need to go back for myself and say, okay, I definitely, I feel like I've learned something, but like, how do I know whether I have? I've been studying these and all the Jewish texts that you all have brought. Am I any different? Am I actually, I say I've learned about Teshuvah. Have I? Is there any evidence any lived evidence that I do? Because I feel like I feel like, one of my thing, I to the extent that I am cheaty, I think that's valuable. And I think I want to think more about that, about the cheaty process in particular. Or about the moments where, like Eleanor at the end says, that she kind of realizes that she, like, because of the book that he gave her, that she asked to let him go. Like, for some reason that matters to me, and I'm trying to sort of think about whether that's just a taste, like that's just how I operate in the world, or whether there's a broader Jewish thing, to value around that.
I don't know if this directly answers your question, but I think one of the most interesting pieces of this podcasting experience has been about sort of what does it mean to treat different kinds of text as sacred and important, and build a Jewish narrative around what is essentially a secular, a secular text. And I think one of the things that I've taken from this experience is some of that. I listened to this other podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where they use sacred reading practices, right, for Harry Potter. And I never really thought about this before, but I do think some of what some of the principles apply here as well, which is like, and is one of the things that I think I try to spend a lot of time on with my students, which is how do we take the things that are part of your life and give them a Jewish frame, right? And that feels, even if I learned nothing from this podcast, right, which I didn't, I learned many things, but that feels like a really important piece of learning, which is that you can take the things that are important to you in your life and you can connect them to your Jewish life, because what it means to be a Jew in the world is actually to engage Judaism in all areas of your life. And it can be, philosophically, and you can study moral philosophy, but also like, you can connect it to pop cultural references and ideas that are in television shows. And, we're going to send John and Dan Ross to pop culture school so they can learn about some of the references. It's going to be with Sari, the pop culture
I
school.
will be teaching it as the entire basis of my rabbinate has actually been.
But I do think that is a real skill in the modern world, is to take something that feels important to people and say, this is actually a way in which you can kind of merge your Jewish identity and your secular identity.
But do you want to say, oh, Sari, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, yes, obviously. And I think the other way also, right? I think one of the things that the show did really brilliantly, and that I think I would guess we all try to do, hopefully brilliantly as well, right, is also not go both from like, okay, how does my life relate to this, but also how does this relate to my life? And I think, Daniel, when you were talking about the like shift from the blackboard to life, right, I think a lot about the way our sacred texts teach that way, right? And I will be the first to admit that I tell this story often, like the first Talmud class I ever taught, I walked out of because the logic, it was so gray and confusing and made no sense to me. But then, I think about the ways that our text like presents big ideas, big principles, and then says, Ma'aseh lamelech basar v'dam, right? It says, okay, now we're going to go into, which translates literally to a story of a flesh and blood king, but really is about like, okay, so let's take this big concept and translate it into everyday life and everyday action. And right, so I know for me, so often that's the moment where the concept crystallizes more than like a lot of, big words and confusing ideas. It's like, oh, okay, this is how it plays out. And I think about that a lot with, when I work with my B'nai Mitzvah students and, they're wrestling with like, when they're reading in Leviticus, like what does sacrifice mean to a 12 or 13-year-old kid in 2023, right? We have to move it from the blackboard level to, okay, like how might this play out in your life, right? What is the Ma'aseh melech basar v'dam?
I just want to mention that Rebecca disappeared briefly. She said there's a fire alarm going on in the
Oh, cool.
building where she is, so hopefully all is well at Central
Amazing.
Synagogue.
Yeah, and you'll put a good question in the chat.
Yeah. Do you want to pose it, Daniel, and we'll talk about it?
Sure. Is Daniel posing it? Okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the role of God, or the lack thereof, in The Good Place. And I find God in contemporary Jewish life as a kind of background concept that you can have, the lived experience Sari was just talking about, without needing to turn to God in any kind of way, and have a rich and engaged Jewish life with Jewish thoughts. And if you want to go deeper, I think you're going to land in a God place. And I wonder if that is also the case in this TV show. Do we assume that there's a God somewhere deep down or not? And is that a point of similarity or difference to Judaism and life? I haven't thought deeply about it, but I wonder if others have thoughts.
I mean, it's never stated, but just picking up on Daniel's question, is the judge God? Like,
I will definitely live in a world where Maya Rudolph is God.
I mean, yeah, totally. Especially because she loves podcasts, right? Like,
obviously from the start of the show, The Good Place, they, with the whole which religions got it right, and Doug Forsett, had it on his own. I think there's a clear sense of, okay, we're trying to lower your, or eliminate your expectations. We're using this scene we're using this setup, to sort of grab something familiar to you, but we're not buying into this, at all. And right, is Michael God? Are Michael and Janet gods? Even is Sean, whatever, demons and all of that. And that's a really good question of putting it, like, is the judge God? And because I don't know, my head has sort of exploded around I have one of those, the dot over the eye of Jeremy Bearimy that broke me when I think about these questions. Because I sort of like, what I feel like in my personal theology is that I have a sense of the divine and divinity, not that, but sort of as divinity around. And I actually wrestle against sort of that personification. And whoops, what did I just do on the stream? Trying to add us back. Sorry, we're just Rebecca's back from her fire alarm. So
there's a lot of construction.
And I'm trying to, I'm trying to get us all spotlighted back. And so I like all times to be able to talk about God as presented in Jewish tradition in a metaphorical sense, and while having the right of having my own personal kind of spirituality. And so I don't know, I feel like anytime I want to say, well, the eternal beings are like God, I'm afraid to do that. I don't know why. In The Good Place, I'm afraid to make that analogy there, to make it too hard and fast, if that makes any sense. Had you had a kernel of something, different about that, Daniel? Or?
I think that Dan's question of, is the judge God? I'd like to reframe that and say, in what ways is the judge like God? And what does it add to our understanding of God to think of those ways? I was reflecting on that, Dan, and I felt like the judge is God in the ways that we see God portrayed in sort of the area of the Torah we're reading these weeks, where God has some powerful emotions and some thoughts about how things go, and is also open to feedback and improvisation and changing the rules as needed. So there are ways in which the judge is like God. Also, there are ways in which Michael is like God, because Michael, in effect, created a world in which, in this case, 4 people, but just a couple of people, maybe you can.
And Janet, there's some ways in which Janet is like God.
Who knows everything. Exactly. Right. And though it's interesting, because Janet is kind of like the God that I think a lot of people dream a fantasy god to be, a god who just responds to all of your wishes and gives you what you ask for, and then everyone is disappointed, doesn't really exist. Michael is also a god that I think a lot of disaffected, formerly religious people think of as like the real god, as like a devious schemer who's out there for his own ends, but then goes and changes and whatever, you know. So I guess, you know, just to wrap up this train of thought, you can see aspects of Jewish depictions of God in a lot of these different characters, but I don't think that The Good Place has a creator, or a sense that there's an arbiter of what's right and wrong in an objective sense. Like the arbiters of what's right and wrong are like these demons who you can argue with. And I think that a lot of Jewish philosophy, such as it is, does at root have a kind of basic expectation that human beings don't have all the tools necessary to answer all the questions and to know all the things, and that there's an appeal to that which is beyond the human realm in order to justify anything that we do, which is different from what animals do. And I'm not sure where The Good Place would land on that question.
I think I do really love the idea that The Good Place gets to a place where the humans design a system in which the eternality of our souls or our beings, you know, is very individual and stays without it being dependent on that having been done by God or a gods, and that maybe it's backed up by, you know, Michael and then Vicky and the system, but they didn't design it, or, you know, I think it's very covenantal in that way, in some of the ways that are probably our kind of Judaism, and maybe in some ways what I think of as some of the more interesting theology stories in Talmudic Judaism are where God, you know, who in the world of that time was so not all powerful, obviously didn't, or at least, you know, chose not to exercise that power on behalf of the Jewish people. And so we imagined God as you know, as having to sort of deal with the world as it is. And sort of talk, and I think we've referenced the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who knows exactly what God wants, in an argument with all the other rabbis, and the other rabbis are like, you know, that's not relevant to us, your prophetic abilities or your, you know, scheme. And then when he ultimately loses, and, you know, God doesn't get God's way through him, and they ask Eliyahu Hanavi, you know, Elijah the prophet, well, what is God thinking about? And says that God, you know, laughed. My children have defeated me. And which reminds me that I forgot on the last episode when we were talking about Eliyahu to mention that our little bum 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 is the Eliyahu, the Elijah song. Yeah. Anybody else want to say anything to Daniel's theology question? Let's see. I had something else that floated out of my head. I don't know. I would ask this as sort of a kernel of something, maybe to Sari and Rebecca. You know, first, if you've started to think about this, like the original iteration of, okay, like how could we use this in, you know, curriculum with young people? Like, is that something? Have you had any beginnings of thoughts about that? I actually think that we should convene a workshop of educators to sort of workshop. But do you know how you like the first thing you might say is your personal testimony on that, or have you already been trying?
It would actually be, I think, like a great service to the world if we made source sheets from each episode and put them on Sefaria, like as a collection, because I do think a lot of people like to teach this, and I see it like in lots of different groups and all kinds of things, and people are like, does anyone have source sheets on this? So anyway, when you're like looking for another project, I think we should consider that as a project to do. And so that's just thing one. But, you know, I think I wish more of my younger students were interested in this, like knew about the show and wanted to watch it. I mentioned it to a student who had like we had a very intense theology discussion about good and evil and what happens to you after you die and all of those things. And I was like, you got to watch this show. And he said, oh, well, I'm going to watch it over the summer. He had never heard of it. And so I think we'd have to bring it back a little bit if we were going to teach it to younger kids. But I do think this is a great way to get kids interested in big philosophical questions. And also the idea that like not everything is as cut and dried as you might have been led to believe, right? Like God may not be a man in the sky, whatever, deciding on your every move, and that there are a lot of complex answers to a lot of different questions. I'm really sorry, but I have to jump off from our discussion, but it was great to be able to talk to everyone all in one place. And I will throw it to Sari since you asked her that question too.
Yeah.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Bye, Rebecca. I haven't actually given it that much thought, I'll confess. I mean, it feels like a really natural high holiday based or high holiday kickoff or Elul prep session, right? With so much about Tshuva. I also, again, this would not be me writing this, I'm putting this to someone else, but like I certainly think that if you wanted to introduce young folk, right, to like some big theological and ethical, again, like I think global, right, like I'm thinking about like the trolley problem, which like, and you want to introduce it both like, okay, here is the traditional sort of moral question or moral challenge, and then you can watch it on The Good Place, where I think they explain it in a way that makes sense, and then lead kids through a discussion of like, okay, here's how our tradition looks at it. So again, I think it's a really, I'm going to go back to where I started, right, which is I think that it's sort of it's such a good universalization of broad moral philosophy, which I guess is universal by nature. And maybe my job would then be to particularize it.
I would just pop in with one more thing, which is, John, I think in our very first conversation about this, you asked like if we had to choose between someone reading each of the 54 weekly Torah portions versus watching the 53 episodes of The Good Place, and which would be more formative for their character. I know, Sari, I'm thinking the same thing. Good Place Torah study, kind of like let's just do it. Let's make that Saturday mornings instead of
But that would be right. That would give us Rebecca's thing, right? Then we would have 53 source sheets.
We could.
So I'm like, my mind is now blown.
Challenge not yet accepted, but definitely.
Well, which we do. I mean, we can convert the web pages. The show notes for each show have the raw material for that. As we all know, that a teacher isn't just a list of source sheets. It has to be sort of programmed out. But I think the beginnings of that are available, and I would love to turn them into the Sefaria. It wouldn't be that difficult at all to take what we have already and at least make the source material.
Ask ChatGPT to do it, John. Like that's where this is all going. I too, unfortunately, have to hop off. But
yeah, we all do. We've been here for about an hour. Thank you guys for participating, and all of you who joined and listened to us. Please continue if you want to fire us questions and ideas. We'll keep this project open for a little while more and always be able to respond to it. Tov at tovgoodplace.com. And everyone have a great rest of the day and a good upcoming Shabbat.
Feel better, Sari.
Thank you. I have the Gatorade. I'm, just
all right,
hanging out here.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks, John.
Thank you.